Hey, can y'all see that okay?
Yeah.
Excellent. Perfect. So yeah, we're going to talk about co-op solutions to seniors housing. Seniors housing is a issue in Canada generally. There's multiple ways to solve it. At Co-operatives First, we help people start co-ops. And so the angle I'll talk about a little bit is how people are using co-ops to address seniors housing challenges or shortages in available seniors housing services. And a little bit about us first. Co-operatives First is a small nonprofit. This is our whole team, um, based in Saskatoon, but we work across all of Western Canada, from Manitoba out to BC. Our organization is funded by the Cooperative Retailing System through Federated Cooperatives Limited, and our goal is to raise awareness of cooperatives and how you can use cooperative solutions um, for economic development challenges. And we do that work by working with entrepreneurs to create new cooperatives. In our just shy of 9 years of being around, we've helped create well over 100 new cooperative businesses. We work primarily in rural and indigenous communities in the West, and a lot of the work, especially this last year, has been focused on filling service gaps, um, preventing the loss of businesses, addressing things that reflect our changing population dynamics, including seniors living, and all kind of fall under that umbrella of community-led economic development. In 2024, we saw a real big push on the creation of new housing organizations, housing cooperatives to address affordable housing shortages, as well as new childcare centers, both of which responding to federal government programs. And I'll touch on one of those in a bit. So that's a little bit about us. Let's talk a bit about seniors housing. I assume everybody here is a little bit involved, at least, in seniors housing, whether it's for yourself or for a family member. And it's a conversation that we've been having quite a bit all across Western Canada. A little bit less so in Alberta, because of course Alberta's got a pretty young population. But in any small town, small city, rural area, we kind of see a lot of common trends. And that's people want to stay in their home. That people want to age in place. You've called, your community home for however many years. But a lot of times people will reach a certain point and they can't access the kind of housing they need or the types of care that they need to continue living in their community. And so we often see seniors having to relocate to bigger cities to access more healthcare services, to access long-term care solutions. And if there are good seniors housing options available in smaller towns or smaller cities, they often fill up quick because people do want to stay close to their family or the lives that they've built. And so being able to age in place is actually quite rare in Western Canada. Another reason seniors living facilities are so important is because we have a housing shortage generally. We just don't have enough homes to accommodate young people looking to get into the housing market, or newcomers who are moving to Canada for work. And if in many cases, seniors are staying in their homes for longer and longer and longer. Decades ago, it was quite common to see seniors sell their home and move into a smaller building around 70, 75. More and more people are waiting until they're 80, 85, 90 before they downsize to an apartment or a seniors care center. It's also important for communities to think about more seniors housing simply to add to the diversity. Increasingly, land prices keep going up, the cost of building keeps going up, the time it takes to build increases. And so getting more dense in our approaches to building better allows us to respond to that need for housing. So considering how we can approach something in new and innovative ways, maybe a little bit more denser, more apartment style living, all those are really good strategies for communities to be considering. It's also worth considering what kinds of care people need now and in the future. The baby boomer generation is our biggest generation in Canada at the moment. they're all right around retirement age and into their 70s. And so, what kinds of care will communities need to respond to those people continuing to age into their 80s and 90s? Um, and all of these things are worthwhile to think about because it makes your community more attractive. We don't want to see out migration from our towns. We want to see people coming in to our communities and creating a housing market or an environment that's welcoming for seniors that allows people to age in place is going to make your community much more attractive. And just for some context, again, I'm not sure how many folks are familiar with the different kind of business models that are used in seniors housing, but broadly, I'm going to kind of use two big umbrellas to talk about seniors housing. I'll talk about a couple of different ways you can organize to create seniors housing cooperatives, but I do want to touch on these two very different ways of approaching seniors living. The first I'll call seniors living or seniors housing. And this is pretty common in Canada, where you have apartment buildings or small townhouses or a small gated community where seniors are going to sell their home and they're going to downsize. We have a lot of those in Canada, a lot of, say, 55 plus or 60 plus or 75 plus communities where people can live independently. They can cook for themselves, they can clean for themselves, and they can maintain their own household. They're just looking to downsize. The other model is a more care-centric model, and that's a personal care home. Most personal care homes in Canada may still be apartment buildings, or they may be what I've heard called the big house model, where you have one large building, people have smaller suites, meals are often provided, there may be nursing staff on site, but there's a higher level of care because people aren't quite as able to provide all their daily needs for themselves. So you might have cooks, you might have healthcare staff, things like that. And so the way that those organizations work, the type of fundraising you'll do for those, the expenses associated with those are very, very different. So I'll touch on both of them as I talk through the presentation, but I just wanted to address up front that there's very different ways of addressing and thinking about seniors housing. I should say too, if anybody has questions throughout this, fire them through the chat. Or I think if you turn on your video and just like wave frantically, I'm certainly happy to take questions throughout the presentation, as well as at the end. And so I'll ask a couple of questions just to maybe plant a few seeds. And I'm assuming everybody here is a little bit interested in seniors housing or seniors care, probably because either you or a family member need it now or in the next little bit. And if that is the case, I challenge you to ask yourself, would you personally be willing to help start an organization that provides seniors housing? If you are, would you be willing to serve on, say, a board of directors for an organization that provides seniors housing? And would you personally be willing to invest some time, money, and some passion into a project that's going to expand housing opportunities for seniors, expand care for seniors, whatever it is your community needs? Would you be willing to put in some of that time and money? And if you're answering yes to most of these, well, then it sounds kind of like a cooperative. It sounds like a co-op solution might be the right fit for your seniors housing and seniors care needs. So you might be asking, what is a cooperative? A cooperative is just a way of doing business. It's an incorporated business, so no one individual is personally responsible for the organization. You have a separate legal entity, and it's an alternative way to organizing a business from corporations or nonprofit organizations. Co-ops can be for-profit or not-for-profit, depending on their purpose. And the reason I asked if you were personally interested in starting a housing organization is because co-ops exist to provide goods or services to their owners. The people who own the co-op will use the co-op. If you're a member of the big red and white gas and grocery stores, you're probably shopping at those grocery stores. The same would apply to a housing co-op. In most housing co-op apartments, the people who live at the housing co-op are the owners of the housing co-op. And in doing so, it's an alternative way of owning your own home and an alternative way of renting. What sets co-ops apart from other ways of doing business is they're a little bit more egalitarian. Every member of a co-op has one equal vote. And it's because all members are equal that you can ensure that a co-op makes decisions in the best interest of the members. And if co-ops do turn a profit, and they are a for-profit co-op, they usually share their profits with members using patronage dividends. So it's in proportion to your use of the co-op. And in Canada, we have co-ops operating in all industries of the economy, from oil and gas to childcare and bakeries to broadcasting. And the largest sector where co-ops operate is, in fact, housing. We have approximately 2,200 housing cooperatives in Canada, providing seniors housing, seniors care, affordable housing, and condominium style living. So definitely a good tried and tested model. And I'll share a couple of case studies as I'm talking. Okay, so let's talk a bit about seniors housing co-ops specifically. In Alberta, quick fun facts, there's about 70 housing co-ops in Alberta. I believe a small minority of those, maybe half a dozen, cater specifically to seniors, but the majority of them are affordable housing co-ops, most of which were created in the 70s and 80s when there was big federal government support for affordable housing and a co-op housing development program. And the technical term for those organizations are nonprofit housing cooperatives and home ownership cooperatives. Nonprofit housing cooperatives will usually qualify for government grants and subsidies. Home ownership cooperatives are an alternative to condominiums or stratas. And when you're trying to think about what kind of housing co-op we create, or what a governance or financial model looks like, or how the co-op works, who the members are, and how much people pay and how much money you need to raise, there's a few considerations I'd recommend thinking about. And some of these questions kind of get at things that we would work with a group in terms of business planning. And we were trying to help tease out some of these questions, tease out what an operating model looks like, how an organization would work to respond to a need, and how people can work together to create a co-op that addresses their seniors' housing challenges. So I asked myself, what level of care is needed in town? If you do a scan around Lac-La-Biche area, are there sufficient apartment style living for seniors who are downsizing? Is there enough care homes or spaces in those care homes to respond to the needs today and in, say, 5 years? Amongst seniors in the area, is affordability a concern? In many towns, a lot of seniors have sold businesses, farms, or sold homes that are worth quite a bit. And so sometimes can afford to shoulder some additional costs. But if you need to ensure that there's good space for lower income individuals, then exploring grants or subsidies might be important to ensure that those who need affordable housing can access it. For those who are interested in starting a housing co-op, could the people who live in a senior housing development own and operate the facility? And I ask that because in personal care homes, where people may be, 80, 90 plus, maybe they're dealing with something like dementia, you probably need people from outside of the tenants to help run the organization and serve on a board of directors. I do see a question in the chat asking if this is only for Alberta. The numbers I gave just now were just Alberta numbers, but what I'll be talking about applies anywhere in Canada. Another big question to be asking, because housing is such a tricky sector in Canada, is there available land and sufficient demand? A lot of the folks we end up working with um, have a sense that if you build it, they will come. And that's not always the case. We always recommend that folks crunch the numbers, take a look at the population data, take a look at the age breakdown, and make sure that there's sufficient seniors to fill spaces now and in the future. Otherwise, you might have a hard time maintaining a facility. It's also, I would say, important at a very, very, very early stage to start talking with your municipal governments. The availability of land, and in particular serviceable land, is a real challenge for smaller towns. So understanding what the land situation looks like is so important for a larger housing development. Hey, if there's any questions, do please feel free to fire them through the chat. I'm kind of keeping my eye up on the chat for any of those notifications. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two different ways of organizing a housing cooperative that provides services for seniors, reflecting those different business models that I talked about earlier, the seniors apartments and the personal care homes. So the first of those is a nonprofit housing co-op. And this is ideal if the people who are organizing the housing co-op also want to be the ones who live there. As pictured here, the Old Grace Housing Cooperative, they're often apartment style or townhouse style units where people have their own suite, they have their own self-contained kitchen, bedrooms, living room, a standard house. It's just a little bit smaller usually. And the reason they do that is for scaling purposes. Usually, the primary goal of these organizations is to provide affordable rentals. And the housing charges that are passed along to members each month reflect the costs associated with starting and operating the facility. This type of housing cooperative is eligible for grants. And in particular, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation has a series of programs available for nonprofit housing cooperatives. In 2024, CMHC introduced a new program that can support up to 100% of a project's startup costs. And most of these housing co-ops will raise some combination of member contributions and then financing from either a bank, credit union, or an organization like CMHC. I'll break down an example here in a second. So I'll give a quick example just to showcase how this kind of works. Pictured here is the Western Manitoba Nonprofit Housing Cooperative, which is located in Brandon, Manitoba. Their name is a real mouthful. And their goal back in 2016 was to build 34 units for seniors that wanted to downsize. People wanted to sell their homes and move into something a little bit more manageable for a senior to look after. And so they decided on this apartment style building. The co-op formed and it raised about $700,000 from its membership. And that they did that by charging between roughly $18,000 and $24,000 per member. If you had a bigger unit, you paid a little more. If you had a smaller unit, you paid a little less. So your membership fee was based on the square footage of your unit. They also applied for and were successful in securing provincial and federal grants, and those amounted to $3.1 million. So understanding the landscape for provincial and federal support for affordable housing is really important, because there often is money out there that you can access to help cover startup costs. They also worked with the city of Brandon that made a contribution of land. So the land that they secured, they were able to get at no cost. And they also provided $500,000 in funding. The city also gave them a break on municipal taxes, for, I believe, until their mortgage was paid off. And then the balance, I believe the total cost of the project was something like $5.6 million. The balance of that they borrowed from the local credit union. And so then monthly, the cost of the mortgage, the cost of maintenance, water, and all operational fees were put in together, and that was what created people's monthly housing charges. I believe the members pay between $600 and $800 per month. So very reasonable because it reflects the true costs of operating and because they had significant government support offsetting those startup costs. So that's kind of how a nonprofit housing co-op organizes to provide homes for independent seniors. And amongst the housing co-ops or seniors housing co-ops in Canada, this is probably the most common model. We see lots of these throughout Saskatchewan, Manitoba, BC. We see a small handful in Calgary and Edmonton, and it's quite popular in Quebec. Okay, so I mentioned that those types of housing co-ops are eligible for government support. And in 2024, CMHC announced the introduction of the Co-op Housing Development Program. This program is running until 2028. It was budgeted for in budgets 2022 and 2023, and it can cover up to 100% of total project costs. Eligible housing co-ops can have 100% of costs funded, with 33% being through forgivable loans and 66% being through traditional loans. And those loans are with CMHC, not a private lender or credit union. So projects also get more favorable terms and more favorable interest rates. There are a few project requirements. Any housing co-op needs to commit to being more energy efficient with Canada's current guidelines. They have to commit to meeting a certain number of units. And for communities under 30,000 people, you can have less than 30 units. So it's a case-by-case basis for smaller towns. And you need to commit to making sure that housing charges are less than 110% of median market rent. So if median market rent in Lac-La-Biche is, say, $1,200, your rent has to be around that or below. The next window for applications is winter 2025. When, you might ask? I have no idea. We're waiting any day now for an announcement from CMHC for the next round of applications. I would say if folks are interested in this kind of housing co-op and applying for this program, you should give us a call as soon as possible, because I don't necessarily think this program will be offered for a third round. So yeah, get in touch with us as soon as possible. And again, if there are any questions, please feel free to fire them through the chat. I've also made sure we'll have time at the end if you want to save questions for then. The second type of co-op I'll touch on is what's called a community service co-op. And this is quite different from a nonprofit housing co-op because it's community-led. So the members of the co-op, the people that own the co-op, the people who will serve on the board of directors are usually much more open. Usually it's the people who live in the facility, as well as their family members, friends, local business owners, anybody that wants to support this kind of organization. So it's more community-led in nature. And the reason for that is because they usually provide personal care or care homes. This is a really common model in Saskatchewan, where I believe we've got something like 25 of these community-led personal care homes across the province. We have some in Smeaton, Mossbank, Pearslin, a couple that ensure that there's good seniors care. And the reason they're more inclusive of the broader community is because the healthcare needs of the people who will live in the facility are more diverse. And so you need people who, have more experience running organizations, aren't dealing with dementia, things like that, that can do the work of a board of directors. The cost to build these organizations is often lower because they tend to need less space. Usually these organizations will have communal kitchens, they'll have more shared living spaces, they'll have recreation areas, and the individual member units will often be a little bit smaller. Sometimes they're 500 square feet or less, kind of like a bed sitting room type thing. So the cost of building can be a little lower because the building is smaller, but the cost of operating these organizations is usually much, much higher. Most of these personal care homes will have nursing staff, they'll have cooks, they'll have cleaning staff, and so the human resources costs will be quite a bit higher than the other model I mentioned. And so your monthly housing charges will often be quite a bit more. So I'll give an example of one of these housing co-ops that we've worked with actually, which is coincidentally also in Manitoba. It's located in Sprague, Manitoba, and their building design was a 14,000 square foot, 20 room or 20 bed facility. In that case, I believe each of the units was about 500 square feet or a little bit less, but they still had communal kitchens, communal living space, and lots of recreation area. And the model that they use for care is called an 18/7 supervision. So that meant that there was staff on site for 18 hours of the day, and then residents were unsupervised for 7 hours of a day. So that within the spectrum of care, that falls in between an independent seniors facility and a care home. So it fit the needs of that community, which was Sprague, Manitoba. And at that time, this is much more recent, the cost for this project was about $5.6 million. I know that's similar to the other one that I mentioned, but it's because they're 8 years apart. So construction costs have gone up quite a bit. And the way that the fundraising program worked for this co-op was they're working with CMHC's National Housing Strategy. This kind of co-op is not eligible for the Co-op Housing Development Program. It has to apply for a more traditional affordable housing grant. So they're going for a combination of grants and loans through CMHC's National Housing Strategy. They're raising a lot of funds from the community. They've had donations from the local housing authority. They've had donations from the RM and the municipalities. They've also done a big fundraising campaign. And because this type of work is charitable in nature, they were able to raise money through charitable donations. The goal was to raise, I believe, about $2 million from the community, get an extra amount through donations, including a donation of land, secure a sizable grant through CMHC so that they would bring the cost of borrowing down to about $800,000 to $1 million. Above that, it gets a bit hard to work out the numbers for financing. And with this level of care, of course, the cost goes up because you're incurring food costs, you're incurring healthcare costs. The anticipated rent for this particular co-op is somewhere between $1,700 and $1,800 per month. But of course, that includes heating, food, care, things like that. So the level of service you get is much higher, but the cost does reflect that. Okay, so those are the two models and two case studies for organizing seniors housing. One is very much for independent seniors looking to downsize. The other is for seniors that need a bit more care and probably need more community support on the fundraising aspect and the operations. So very different business models, very different financial models, and very different ways of operating. Whoops. So I'll get into a couple of considerations. If you're liking what I'm saying, if this sounds like something you'd like to get involved with, if the need for seniors housing or seniors care is real in your community, there's a couple of things I'd recommend thinking through. I'd recommend asking yourself and other folks over a coffee, what are the services that we need in Lac-La-Biche? Do we have enough seniors apartments? Do we have enough care spaces? What do we need? And based on that, who's willing to lead a development? Is there a group of seniors who own their own homes and in 5, 10 years know they're going to be selling and need somewhere that they want to move into? Or are there family members who recognize that, mom and dad are going to need a higher level of care at some point? Maybe we should get involved and move something forward. What's the best source of funding right now? If you're operating as a not-for-profit housing co-op, or your goal is to keep things affordable, you may be eligible for federal funding. That's always a great opportunity, but there are time constraints placed on that. Can you get donations from the municipality, from big companies who have a vested interest in seeing the community be healthy? Are there folks who might be willing to donate large amounts of money? Is there a local lender that might give a favorable rate? What's the best source for that funding? Could the seniors pay a good portion like they did in Brandon, coming in with about 20 grand a piece? It's important then to ask, what's your timeline? If you need these services, last year, boy, you best manage some expectations because it does take a minute to build housing in Canada. If you need these services in 3, 4, 5 years, that's almost a sweet spot because that's a good timeline to get people excited, get them involved, put in the work, and deliver on a project. And then it's never too early to ask, what can local government do for us? Municipalities are going to play such an important role in building an organization like this. Have a discussion about what land's available, what land is serviceable. Can we get a break on municipal taxes? Can the municipality make a donation? What can local government do? Because again, at the end of the day, this is going to keep more citizens in town. It's going to keep more people paying taxes, using local services. This is a benefit for the local government. They would most likely be able to lend some support. So what do you need to move a project like this forward? At a bare minimum, you need 3 people to start a co-op, and those 3 people need to be on the same page. For a housing co-op, because it's quite a bit of work, because the timelines are a little longer, and of course, a housing organization usually has more than 3 people living in it, I'd probably recommend shooting for half a dozen people as your project team. That's a pretty reasonable number to make sure no one gets burnt out. The common goal should be what kind of housing you need. Is it a personal care home? Is it independent living? Is it apartments? Is it townhouses? What's that look like? What's our goal? What are we working towards? I'd also recommend crunching some numbers. I think Community Futures could probably point you in the right direction on where to look for business data. So where you could look for what the median market rents are, what's the rent for seniors housing, what are some of the other housing organizations in town, what's the average cost for healthcare staff, for cooking staff, and what's the cost of land or building materials. All those things are important for crunching in, what's that project budget going to look like? What's the square footage on, say, a 20-unit facility? And is that crazy right now? And then identify a path forwards. The 2 cases I mentioned had pretty specific paths. They knew they could fundraise X amount. They knew these grants were available. They could work with local lenders, and they had the population to support this project. So yeah, figure out some of those things, and that'll help shape the path that you'll take to building the housing co-op. I'd also recommend, because we're talking about housing, that folks manage expectations a little bit. In every housing co-op I've worked with, they've always been more than 5 years long. It's an unfortunate reality of living in Canada, that building homes is expensive and time consuming. So if you are getting folks involved, manage some expectations. And that's why I recommend having a slightly bigger project team so no one gets burnt out and you can kind of share the load. The cost of housing, the cost of land, the cost of construction are just realities we have to live with. And in smaller towns, there may not be the same availability of service providers, of contractors, of plumbers, and all the people that you need to make something work. So be mindful that it may take some time from the project start date to when you're ready for people to move in. And then it's also important to be aware of the different regulations. And circling back, this is another reason why it's important to get your municipal government involved right away, is there's probably going to be requirements that need to be changed around zoning, around serviceable lots, around support for affordable housing. So get that local government in the loop sooner rather than later, because again, they may be more than willing to make bylaw amendments and change zoning to accommodate a new development. But having them looped in pretty quick will make those conversations easier when it's time. And if you've got those bare essentials, you've got a team, you've got a goal, you've crunched some numbers on the back of a napkin, go ahead, give us a call. We can definitely then help put out some of the key steps that you'll take to starting a co-op. Our organization really helps folks in those early stages, making sure there's good alignment, making sure co-op's a good fit, and that what we're talking about doing is achievable. From there, you get your members together, we'll help incorporate the co-op, and that'll allow you to do business in a more serious way. You can have actual conversations with your municipality, you can apply for grants, you can apply for bigger housing programs, and you can begin working with one of our business coaches on assembling a funding application or a business plan if your goal is to approach investors and lenders. We also have pretty good connections in the housing community with different service providers and government agencies to help folks identify that path and assemble all the information you need to put together a plan for a grant, for a business, for a loan application, or just to bring your folks together. And then the most time-consuming part of any housing project is ticking all the boxes for an organization like CMHC. There's a really long list. I'd be happy to share with folks the funding requirements for the Co-op Housing Development Program, but largely we help folks assemble all the things they need to apply. But it is a pretty lengthy list of documents that need to be assembled and provided, but we're also happy to do that alongside y'all. So I've touched on this a little bit, but how we can help is support for your startup. When you work with Co-operatives First, you'll be assigned one of our team members to work with your co-op from day one to when the project is completed. We provide lots of support on planning and guidance and helping build the structure of your organization. We'll help you through the incorporation process and getting registered with the government. We'll provide training for any board of directors so folks feel comfortable leading an organization. And we supplement all of that expert advice with online tools and resources. If you're interested in any of those, just check out our website. I'll link to it here in the next slide. But all of our tools, resources, and our support, our one-on-one support, is all free. Our organization's funding from Federated Co-op allows us to do this work at no cost for communities. And that brings me to the end. If folks do want to stay in touch with Co-operatives First, this QR code will take you to a newsletter. You'll hear from us regularly with cool ideas, articles, resources, opportunities. If you want to reach out to me directly, this is my personal email. I'm happy to answer any questions. And if you want to check out our website, there's lots of cool stories, tools, resources, online courses, or material for those interested in co-ops. Okay, I hope that answered some questions folks have. If you do have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, unmute, and ask away.